In business, there's a lot of other laws that apply to how we go about working in organisations and interacting with each other. One of those areas that's particularly important is consumer transactions. And while a lot of consumer transactions do involve a contract law that we've been talking about for a couple of weeks, it also involves specific legislation, and that's what we're going to look at, some key elements of the Australian consumer law. So let's start with a little bit of a background about why we actually need this particular piece of legislation. So the general approach that the law has taken to transactions in business, including consumer transactions, is this one here, this Latin term caveat emptor, or buyer beware. And that was really saying that it's up to the buyer to take responsibility for whatever they purchase, the quality, the suitability of the goods. And they should do that before they purchase, rather than find out about it later and try and get their money back. Because people might change their mind after they really did have a contract, right? So it's trying to guard against that kind of particular problem. But over time, the nature of business transactions changed from, for want of a better term, small craftsperson to another small craftsperson into large businesses transacting with individuals. And so what we had were very trained, large, powerful organisations interacting with individuals who were often uneducated in the things that they were transacting in. So over a period of over 100 years, the law developed approaches to handle these particular situations with the rise of the modern economy. And that's culminated for us in Australian consumer law. In actual fact, this little statement here from Lionel Murphy deals with something called the Trade Practices Act, the TPA, and that preceded the Australian consumer law. It turned into the Australian consumer law when it was repealed and extended. And this slide gives us the development of consumer law. Originally, there were implied terms made up by judges into contracts. Later, each state adopted a Sale of Goods Act, and you can see that happened in the late 1800s. But there were then inefficiencies across the economy. So what we did do was develop a national consumer law, and that's been in place now for around 10 years, a bit under 10 years. The key part of consumer law is set out in Schedule 2 of the Competition and Consumer Act, and it's administered by the regulator, the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. The key purpose of the Act is to stop businesses from harming consumers, okay? So it's about consumer transactions for the most part. We only cover a small part of consumer law, and that's because it's an area where you will run into these elements of the law if you're in any kind of business whatsoever. That can help you be compliant if you're an employee, but also as a consumer, it lets you know what rights you have available. Now, the important thing to recognise is, unlike contract law, which was based upon judges' decisions or common law sense 2, the consumer law is statutory law. So we don't look at case names as much. We actually look at the sections of the Australian consumer law in this section. Now, that's not quite right. We do have some case names when the cases expand or explain how the sections should be applied, but we're mainly relying on the sections of the Australian consumer law. So in this area, you need to be able to write the section number. We're only interested in the sections that we actually have in these lecture slides for examination purposes. Having said that, it would be really useful for you to look up the consumer law and the precise sections, because what we present are often summaries of those sections and not the actual section. And getting familiar with legislation is a nice skill to have. Okay, so that's a bit of an introduction to Australian consumer law. The next thing we're going to do is one of the most important aspects of consumer law, misleading and deceptive conduct.